Hello and welcome to the BMC MainView Quick Course Training Series. In this session, you will learn the steps necessary to start, display, and manage your Db2 traces using MainView for Db2. Before moving on to the views which you will be using to start, display, and manage Db2 traces, we will start by covering a few rules of thumb for Db2 traces. MainView for Db2 includes the ability to start both summary and detail level Db2 application traces. Remember that executing a detailed Db2 application trace adds additional overhead to your Db2 subsystem CPU utilization and can sometimes even degrade Db2 throughput and performance. Detailed Db2 application traces should always be performed judiciously and should also be limited with qualification criteria which narrows down the scope of the data being traced to just those auth IDs, plans, packages, etc. which you are intending to analyze. By default, all the data captured by MainView for Db2 application traces, both detail and summary level, is stored in memory within the MainView for Db2 product address space or PAS. If a user does not explicitly indicate that the Db2 application trace is to be stored in a trace log dataset, also known as a TLDS, the trace data which is captured and stored in the PAS memory is lost when the PAS is recycled or your ZOS LPAR is IPL. For this reason, it is strongly recommended that all traces which are initiated within MainView for Db2 should always be captured to a physical trace log dataset. By capturing the trace to a TLDS, users may also go back and review and analyze the trace data at a later date as often as is necessary. Any users attempting to start traces within MainView for Db2 must also have the appropriate MainView for Db2 and Db2 subsystem authority to perform the trace. The MainView for Db2 product address space user ID must also have the Db2 authority to start traces. 3 distinct traces are started by default at MainView for Db2 product initialization. The thread hist trace is a summary level application trace which contains data for all completed Db2 threads for each subsystem. The big-elap trace is a summary level application trace which contains data only for those threads that executed over 10 elapsed or wall clock seconds for each Db2 subsystem. The big-elap trace is intended to be an exception trace used for capturing data about Db2 threads that are doing something abnormal. The big-elap trace exception criteria parameters can be modified to capture a variety of exception conditions that may be triggered by Db2 threads. The MV-Db2 DC trace is a summary level application trace which contains data for all completed Db2 threads for each subsystem. This trace is also known as the data collector or DBC trace. The MV-Db2 DC trace is the recommended trace to use for displaying information about Db2 threads. This trace is started and controlled through the DBC address space and is also zip enabled. If you use the DBC to produce MV-Db2 DC traces, you should also consider eliminating the use of the thread hist summary trace, since both the thread hist trace and the MV-Db2 DC trace collect the same thread accounting information. The MV-Db2 DC summary trace provides a more efficient way to collect your thread accounting information since it is zip enabled. Here is an example of the EasyDBA menu using the traditional 3270 interface. The application traces, which are executed within MainView for DB2, can be accessed from the left-hand side of this menu under the section titled Traces. The item titled Traces-current/ST will take you to the CT or Current Traces view, where you can access the thread hist and biggie-lap traces. Place your cursor on the Traces-current-ST option and press Enter. If you prefer the browser interface, also known as the MainView Explorer, most of the same functionality is available as is in the 3270 interface. All of the remaining screenshots in this session will be shown using the MainView Explorer GUI interface. There are two functions which at the moment are only available in the 3270 interface. One, viewing detail traces, and two, the print command from the HT or history traces view. In the MainView Explorer interface, you will find the required trace views in the folders titled Thread Hist and Trace within the product tree in the left lower corner of the screen. Of course, you could also use the EasyDBA menu as a starting point in MainView Explorer. By double-clicking either CT-current trace list from within the product tree on the left, or Traces-current ST within the Traces section of the EasyDBA menu, you are then presented with the CT or Current Traces view. The CT view should display both the biggie-lap and the thread hist traces that are running for your current DB2 subsystem. At the top of this view, you will see various line commands which are available to be performed against each trace. To access the drop-down list which provides the line action commands, right-click your mouse on the trace ID name, then click the line action option. The S command will select a particular trace for displaying. The W command will show the parameters that were used to start this trace. The Z command will stop the trace, yet retain all associated data. The P command purges and stops the trace, but also deletes the trace data. You can use the HT logs view to display information about all available sources of thread accounting history for one DB2 subsystem at a time in target mode. This includes each trace log dataset, TLDS, and data from the MainView for DB2 Data Collector active trace datasets. There are several ways to enter HT logs. Use the hyperlink provided at the top of the CT view shown on the previous slide, or double-click HT logs in the product tree in the left lower corner, or double-click thread history/query on the EasyDBA menu. To access the thread records within each trace from the HT logs view, you should now double-click on the number records column for the particular trace you wish to view. You are then taken to the HTI QZ view. The HTI QZ view provides a 15-minute summarization of your thread history activity. There are two options available for drilling down on the thread information from this view. You can either hyperlink on the end time field to further break down a 15-minute summarized interval into 5-minute chunks and 1-minute chunks. Or you can hyperlink on the record count field to go to a list of individual threads for that time period. When you hyperlink on the record count, you will be taken to a listing of all the individual threads for the specified interval. Here we provide an example of the TRL track view, which displays all of the individual threads for an interval within the thread hist trace. To obtain more detailed information about each individual thread, hyperlink on the end time field for a given thread. The TRS track view is then displayed. On the upper right-hand side of the TRS track view, hyperlinks are provided which can be used to navigate directly to a specific section of the thread accounting information. You may also use your PF7 and PF8 keys to scroll up and down sequentially through the information. Let's navigate back to the EZDBA menu now and go into viewing history traces. On the left-hand side of the EZDBA menu, under the Traces section, hyperlink on the Traces-History Admin selection option. You are then taken to the HT or History Traces view. The blue line items indicate traces that have been executed at a previous point in time and are completed. The green line items indicate traces that are still currently running or active. You can hyperlink on any past trace or current trace simply by placing your cursors on the trace ID name and double-clicking your mouse. You will then be taken to the HT Logs view where you will hyperlink on the Number Records field to view the thread history summary and drill into specific threads. The individual thread listing is displayed on the TRL track view shown in this example. You can then hyperlink on the end time field for any thread and display the details pertaining to that thread. There are also highlighted hyperlinks at the top of this screen which allow you to summarize the list of threads by authorization ID, connection type, plan, time, location, and correlation ID. When you take the hyperlink on the end time field to display individual thread details, you are also taken to the TRS track view, which was discussed previously. Now let's navigate back to our EZDBA menu once again to start a Db2 trace. On the left-hand side of the screen, under the Traces section, hyperlink on the option titled Traces-Current ST. You are then taken to the CT or Current Traces view. Hyperlink on the ST Start Application Trace option in the upper section of this view. You will now be presented with a series of 5 panels which contain fields where you will enter all of your trace specification criteria. Start on the upper left-hand side in the target field and verify that the Db2 subsystem ID in that field is the one where you intend to execute the trace. Then enter your trace name, 1 to 8 characters, into the parm field. Underneath the parm field, in the type field, enter the letter S for a summary trace or the letter D for a detail trace. Moving back over to the upper right-hand side of the dialog panel, the Start field indicates at what time you wish the trace to start. If you do not enter a time in this field, the trace will start immediately after you complete entering all the specific trace criteria. You can enter a start time up to 24 hours in advance, and the trace will not start until this time is reached. Moving on to the Stop Time field, you can enter the number of minutes that a trace should run or an actual stop time. If you do not enter a stop time, the trace will run until you stop it manually. The Storage field indicates how much storage is set aside in memory within the MainView for Db2 product address space to store the data before it is written out to physical DASD. It is recommended that you take the default for this field. The Log Track field should always be set to Y, as this indicates that you do want to log the trace to a physical file. The Wrap field indicates how you want the data to be handled when the area in memory where the trace records are stored fills up. Yes indicates that you want to begin wrapping the data in memory from the beginning and overwriting the oldest data. No indicates that you do not want to wrap the data and you will not continue to write any more data to memory. The Rst field is the restart field. This indicates how you want to handle the trace should MainView for DB2 be brought down while the trace is running. The hot parameter indicates that when MainView for DB2 is brought back up, you want this trace to be initiated again using all the same parameters as was when it stopped. The purr or purge command indicates that you do not want this trace to be restarted and all associated data for this trace will be deleted. The QIS or quies command indicates that you do not want this trace to be restarted. However, you do want to keep all associated data that was collected for this trace prior to MainView for DB2 being stopped. In the title field, provide a meaningful title name so that you can easily identify and differentiate your trace. Under the Specify Additional Trace Options section, let's start with the selection criteria. Put a Y in this field so you will be able to indicate the specific plans, correlation IDs, etc. that you want this trace to run against. The Exception Filters column is used for specifying selection criteria that you want to utilize for limiting what data is actually written to your trace file. The Detail Trace Options field should be set to Y when you are trying to initialize a DB2 detail trace. This will allow you to specify what kind of detail trace you will be executing. The Trace Log Dataset Options field should also be set to Y. This will display a dialog panel where you are able to specify the criteria for your physical trace log dataset. Additional trace targets. A value of Y or yes without anything specified in the context field will display a dialog that lists the product's active service points or targets, which can be selected to start or replicate a trace request in another DB2 subsystem. The default is N or no, and no additional traces will be started. When you have entered all of the information on the previous panel, press the OK button, and you are presented with the DB2 Trace Selection Criteria panel. This panel is of particular importance when you are initiating a detailed DB2 trace. When you are starting a detailed trace, you must specify at least one valid plan name or auth ID in the selection criteria of this dialog, otherwise the detailed trace will not be started. If you are not executing a detailed trace and are running a summary trace, these fields are optional. Press OK and you will be taken to the DB2 Trace Exception Filter panel. This panel is used to identify criteria that filters and saves just those records that meet the criteria that is specified on this panel. All these conditions that are shown on this panel are OR conditions, meaning that if any one of these conditions is met, the trace record will be written to the trace file. In this example, we've entered a 5.0 in the CPU field, which indicates that only those threads which execute over 5 CPU seconds will be saved and written to the trace. Press OK, and then you are presented with the DB2 Detail Trace Options panel. The upper section of this panel is used to specify which type of detailed DB2 trace you wish to start. If you want to start a SQL trace, you would put a Y in the SQL column. If you want to start an IO trace, you would put a Y in the IO column. You can have multiple trace types executing in a single Db2 trace. In the Specify Event Compression section, take the default set to Group SQL Y. The Specify Data Collection Buffer Options field indicates how much area in memory and what number of buffers will be used to store your detailed Db2 trace as it is collected. It is recommended that you take your installation defaults for the tr size and tr buff parameters. If you leave the tr buff column blank, this will allow the defaults to take effect and will allocate the maximum number of buffers allowable to store your trace data. When you press OK, you are presented with the Trace Log Dataset Options panel. On the Number of Logs field, you can specify a number from 1 to 99 to indicate the number of physical log files that should be used to store your trace data. The first log DSN field is used to specify the dataset name for your trace log dataset. Should you choose to supply a dataset name here, you must enclose the dataset name in single quotation marks, and the last node of the dataset name must be specified as V01. Should you choose not to supply a dataset name, it will default to the installation supplied dataset name, which appears in bold print below this field. The dataset name that is specified for your trace log dataset, whether you specify a unique dataset name or the installation supplied default, must have the appropriate RACF, ACF2, or top secret authority so that the MainView for DB2 product address space can allocate and write to that dataset name. The Overwrite Logs field is used to indicate that once all of your trace log datasets are full, you want to begin overwriting those logs from the first or oldest log forward. If you do not wish to overwrite your trace log datasets, place an N in this column, and once all of the trace log datasets are full, trace logging will be stopped. However, the trace will continue to run. The Archive Proc field is used to specify a JES proc name where you should use program DZT-BVUNL to archive a trace log dataset as it fills. The log switch time field is used to provide a specific time at which you want one of the logs to switch. For example, if you wish the log to switch at noon, you would enter 12:00 in the log switch time field. The disposition field is used to indicate the disposition of your trace log dataset. If you are creating a new trace log dataset, you type new in this field. If you are reusing an existing trace log dataset, you would type old in the disposition field. Supply the volume IDs for one or more DASD volumes in the volume field where the trace log datasets will reside. In the primary cylinders field, provide a number of cylinders that should be allocated for each trace log dataset. Keep in mind that detailed traces require more space, so you should adjust the primary cylinders accordingly for detailed traces. The data Set Dsn Suffix is used to designate the last node that will be appended to the data component of the VSAM trace log dataset. You can either take the default of D, or you can supply a 1 to 8 character name of your choosing. If you are an SMS managed shop, you can also supply your SMS parameters to the right. When you have supplied all of the parameters within these 5 dialog panels, you'll be taken back to the Start DB2 Trace Request panel. You must press the OK key one more time from this panel to initiate your trace. If you set up your trace to execute immediately by leaving the start time blank, or if you have set the active trace up to execute in the future and this time has been reached, the status is changed to active. Scroll to the right and make sure that your logging status is active, and you will also be able to see the name of your TLDS or trace log dataset. To see the threads that are captured in your trace, you should hyperlink on the Trace ID name column. When you wish to stop your trace, go to the current or CT If you set up your trace to execute immediately by leaving the start time blank, or if you have set the trace to execute in the future and this time has been reached, the status is changed to active. Scroll to the right and make sure that your logging status is active, and scroll to the right and make sure that your logging status is active, and you will also be able to see the name of your trace log dataset. To see the threads that are captured in your trace, you should hyperlink on the Trace ID name column. When you wish to stop your trace, go to the CT or Current Traces view and right-click on the name of the trace you wish to stop. You will be presented with a drop-down where you will click on Line Action. You will be presented with another drop-down menu where you will select the Stop Trace Line Action. This will stop your trace and the trace logging. You should verify that your trace has stopped by scrolling over to the right and displaying the status field. You should see a status of complete when your trace has been stopped. You may also delete traces that are no longer needed by using the delete command on the HT or History Traces view. When you hyperlink on the delete option near the top of this view, a dialog box will be displayed allowing you to delete traces in several different ways. This function is developed for people who are responsible for trace administration at your site. The older than option is very helpful if there are a large number of old application traces that you wish to delete. This concludes the MainView for DB2 Starting and Managing Application Traces session. For more information about any BMC mainframe product, please visit the URL shown in this slide.